Welcome back to Midnight Affair Tales. Thank you for joining us. Chapter 1. Discovered. The moment Warren Delacroix stepped into his house, he felt something was off. The air was different, thicker, almost suffocating. He loosened his tie, his mind still occupied with the long hours in court, but as he walked through the hallway, a faint, unfamiliar scent hit him. Perfume. Not Savannah's. His heart rate quickened. His wife had always worn soft, floral scents, but this was different, strong, musky, masculine. A knot tightened in his stomach. He moved toward the living room, eyes scanning for something, anything, that felt out of place. And then he saw it. A jacket draped over the arm of the couch. Not his. Warren reached for it, his fingers brushing over the expensive leather. It smelled of cologne and cigarettes. He checked the label inside. Dax Remington. A name he had heard before. A man with a reputation, a dangerous one. His throat went dry. He turned toward the staircase leading up to his bedroom. His mind screamed at him to stop. Don't go up there. Don't look. But his body moved on its own, one step after another, until he reached the door. He didn't need to push it open. It was already slightly ajar. Soft laughter. A low moan. Sheets rustling. Warren's chest burned as he reached for the doorknob. He had stood in countless courtrooms, presided over the most vicious cases, but nothing prepared him for this moment. With a slow, deliberate motion, he pushed the door open. And there she was. His wife. In their bed. With another man. Savannah didn't even flinch. She smirked. Oh, you're home early. Warren's entire world shattered. His grip tightened on the door frame, nails digging into the wood. He could barely breathe. How long? How many times had she done this? How many nights had he been working late, oblivious to the betrayal happening right under his nose? Dax looked at him lazily, his muscular arm draped around Savannah. You gonna stand there and watch, Judge? Or you wanna join in? Warren's vision blurred with rage. His fists clenched. His pulse pounded in his ears. And then Savannah said it. The words that lit the match to an already burning fire. You were never enough for me. His breath caught. His world spun. Was this it? Was this the truth? Everything inside him screamed to act, to do something. But Warren had spent his life enforcing the law, following the rules. Would he break them tonight? Or would he wait, and make them both pay the right way? What would you do if the person you loved the most betrayed you like this? Chapter 2. Deception. Warren didn't say a word. He turned and walked out, the air pressing against his chest like 1,000 pounds of concrete. Savannah's laughter followed him. That's it? You're just gonna leave? Dax chuckled. Guess the big bad judge ain't got a backbone after all. The door slammed shut behind Warren, but the noise did nothing to quiet the chaos in his head. He gripped the staircase railing, his knuckles turning white. He needed to think. He needed to breathe. But all he could see was her, lying in their bed under another man, smiling like she had won. She thought she had beaten him. She thought he was weak. She had no idea who she was dealing with. His mind raced. How long had this been going on? Months? Years? Had it ever been real, or was she always just waiting for something better? He staggered into his study, locking the door behind him. He needed answers. And there was only one way to get them. He opened his desk drawer, pulling out a small black box. Inside was a tiny surveillance camera. He had used it once during a high-profile trial to catch a corrupt businessman. Now, he would use it on his own wife. The rage in his chest simmered, controlled, weaponized. He would gather proof. He would find out everything. And when the time was right, he would make her regret ever crossing him. Chapter 3. The Confrontation. The next evening, Warren sat in his car, watching the hidden footage from his laptop. He should have stopped. He should have looked away. But he didn't. Savannah's lies played out in real time. The secret kisses. The hushed phone calls. The betrayal. Warren clenched his jaw. His entire body tensed as he watched his wife whisper sweet nothings to another man. And then, something else. Dax's voice, cocky and overconfident. What about your husband? He's a damn judge. You think he won't find out? Savannah laughed. Warren? Please. He's a coward. He'll do nothing. That's why I'm with you. Warren's breath left his lungs. A coward? She thought he was weak. That was her biggest mistake. He shut the laptop, his hands steady now. He knew what he had to do. This wouldn't be about emotions anymore. It would be about justice. And justice always gets served. Chapter 4. The Other Man. Warren sat in his car outside the courthouse, the weight of Savannah's words pressing down on him. He's a coward. His hands curled into fists. He had built his entire life around justice, integrity, and strength. And yet, in the eyes of the woman he had loved for 15 years, he was nothing more than a weak, disposable man. His fingers hovered over his phone. He could call his lawyer, file for divorce, take the high road. But then he thought of Marlo, their daughter, his reason for everything. She had no idea what kind of woman her mother really was. No clue that the man she would soon be forced to call stepdad was nothing more than a criminal thug. Warren's rage turned to cold calculation. He needed to know everything about Dax Remington. With a deep breath, he unlocked his office, sat at his desk, and pulled up the police database. He knew it was illegal to dig into someone's records without cause. But Warren wasn't a judge tonight. Tonight he was a husband, a father, a man with nothing left to lose. Within minutes, he had the entire file open in front of him. Dax was worse than he thought. Arrest for assault, domestic violence, drug trafficking. A long list of sealed cases hidden away by high-paid attorneys. And Savannah had brought this man into their home? Near their daughter? Warren's pulse pounded. He clenched his jaw. This wasn't just about infidelity anymore. This was about protection. And if the law wouldn't stop Dax, he would. Chapter 5. The Fallout. Call to Action. Moment number 1. Warren didn't go home that night. Instead, he drove aimlessly through the dark streets of New Orleans, his mind replaying every lie Savannah had told him. Every time she smiled at him, kissed him, told him she loved him, knowing damn well she was sneaking around behind his back. He ended up outside a dive bar, the kind of place where men like Dax did their business. His fingers drummed against the steering wheel. Should he go in? Should he confront him? Then his phone buzzed. A message from Savannah. Savannah, I filed for divorce today. Thought you should know. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Harder? She had no idea what hard looked like. Warren stared at the screen, his grip tightening. He could let her go. Walk away. Let her live her new life with her filthy criminal lover. But then another thought hit him. What about Marlo? She was still stuck in the middle of this mess. What if Dax laid a hand on her? His breath came faster. His vision blurred. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He wasn't going to sit back and let Savannah take his daughter away. He was going to fight. And the first step? Taking Dax down for good. What would you do if you found out the man your wife cheated with was dangerous? Would you let it go, or would you make sure he never hurt anyone again? Chapter 6. The Warning. Warren sat in his office the next morning, staring at the evidence file he had compiled on Dax. It wasn't just his criminal record, it was everything. Bank statements. Known associates. His every weakness. This was what Warren did for a living. He took men like Dax apart, piece by piece. And today would be no different. By noon, he was parked outside Savannah's new apartment. The one she had moved into with him. Marlo was at school, thankfully. This conversation wasn't for her ears. Warren knocked once. Twice. The door swung open. Dax stood there, shirtless, a smug grin on his face. Well, he said. If it ain't the big bad judge. You lost or something? Warren didn't flinch. He stared Dax down, his voice calm. Controlled. This is the only warning you'll get, Warren said. Stay away from my daughter. Dax chuckled, leaning against the doorframe. Your daughter? That's funny. Because from where I'm standing, your little girl is about to have a new daddy. Warren's blood ran cold. Dax stepped closer, lowering his voice. Face it, Judge. You lost. Your wife is mine. Your kid will be too. And you? You're nothing. Warren clenched his fists. Every instinct screamed at him to strike, to wipe that grin off Dax's face. But no. Not yet. Instead he smiled. A slow, knowing smile. I'll remember you said that, Warren said. And when this is all over, so will you. Then he turned and walked away, already knowing exactly how this would end. Because men like Dax, they always thought they were untouchable, until they weren't. Chapter 7. Breaking Point. The call came late that night. Warren had been sitting in his dimly lit office, running through his plan for taking down Dax when his phone buzzed. Marlo. His stomach clenched. She never called this late. Dad? Her voice was small. shaky, scared. Warren shot to his feet. What's wrong? There was a pause. Then, a muffled sniffle. It's Dax, she whispered. He grabbed my arm. Mom told him to stop, but he didn't listen. Warren went still. Cold. He had been prepared to destroy Dax professionally. To use the law. But now it was personal. His grip tightened around the phone. His voice dropped into something dark. Where are you? Marlowe hesitated. Home. Mom's in her room. He's drinking again. Her voice cracked. Dad, I don't feel safe. Warren's vision went red. That was all he needed to hear. He grabbed his car keys. Listen to me, sweetheart, he said. Go to your room. Lock the door. Stay on the phone with me. Then he stepped into the night, his heartbeat slow, steady, lethal. He had tried to play fair. Tried to be patient. That was over now. Tonight, Warren Delacroix wasn't a judge. Tonight, he was a father on the warpath. Chapter 8, The Storm. Warren's car tore through the streets of New Orleans, headlights cutting through the dark, rain-slicked pavement. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel. His heartbeat thundered in his ears. Dax put his hands on Marlowe. That one thought pounded inside his skull like a drumbeat of rage. He pressed his foot harder on the gas. Tonight he wasn't a judge. Tonight he was a father, and nothing else mattered. The apartment complex came into view. He killed the engine and stepped out, the cool night air doing nothing to tame the fire burning in his chest. His phone was still pressed to his ear. Marlowe, he said, his voice steady but firm. Are you in your room? Yes, she whispered. The door is locked. But I can hear him, Dad. He's yelling at Mom again. Warren's jaw clenched so tight it felt like his teeth would shatter. Stay where you are. I'm coming up. He moved fast, his long strides eating up the distance to the front door. He didn't knock. He didn't hesitate. He kicked the door open. The scene inside was exactly what he expected, and worse. Savannah stood in the living room, arms crossed, her face twisted in anger. But Dax? He was pacing, bottle in hand, rage curling his lips into a snarl. As the door banged open, Dax turned. His bloodshot eyes narrowed. Well, look who it is, he slurred. The big bad judge, coming to save the day. Warren's eyes didn't even flick to Savannah. He was locked on Dax. Where is my daughter? Dax smirked. Upstairs. She's fine. Just a little scared is all. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate. Testing him. What's the problem, Judge? Can't handle another man raising your kid? That was it. The last straw. Warren's fist connected with Dax's jaw before the man could blink. The sound of bone cracking filled the room. Dax stumbled back, crashing into the table, the bottle slipping from his fingers and shattering against the floor. Savannah gasped. Warren. But he wasn't listening. Dax groaned, spitting blood. He pushed himself up, his dazed expression quickly twisting into fury. You just made a big mistake, Judge. Warren cracked his knuckles. No. You did. Chapter 9, The Warning Shot. Dax wiped his mouth, his eyes gleaming with something between rage and amusement. You think you can come into my home and put your hands on me? He hissed. You really think I'm scared of you? Warren didn't blink. I don't need you to be scared. I just need you to understand what happens next. Savannah stepped between them, her face pale. Both of you need to stop. Right now. Warren ignored her. He took another step toward Dax. You're done here, he said. You're not going to be around my daughter. You're not going to breathe near her. You're not going to be in this apartment after tonight. Dax laughed, a slow mocking sound. And what if I don't go? He took a step closer, his breath reeking of whiskey. You gonna call the cops, Judge? You gonna take me to court? Warren's lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. No. I don't need the cops. Dax's smirk faltered. Warren leaned in, lowering his voice to something dark, something dangerous. I know everything about you, Dax. Every charge you've ever had. Every deal you've ever made. Every crime you thought you got away with. He tilted his head. You're a cockroach. And I'm about to step on you. For the first time, Dax hesitated. A flicker of doubt crossed his face. Warren pressed forward. You think Savannah is going to protect you? She won't. She never protects anyone but herself. He turned slightly, locking eyes with her. Isn't that right, sweetheart? Savannah's lips parted, but no words came out. Dax scoffed, shaking off the momentary hesitation. You think you scare me? Warren pulled something from his pocket and held it up. A USB drive. Dax frowned. What the hell is that? Proof, Warren said simply. That you're going away for a long time. Unless, of course, you decide to leave town. Tonight. Dax's face darkened. You're bluffing. Warren didn't blink. Try me. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then Dax's fingers flexed into fists. This ain't over, Judge. Warren smiled. Yes, it is. Chapter 10, The Oath. Dax was gone by morning. Savannah sat on the couch, arms crossed, her eyes filled with fury. You think this is over? She spat. You don't get to control my life, Warren. He exhaled slowly, his patience razor-thin. This was never about you, Savannah. This was about Marlo. She scoffed. Marlo was fine. You overreacted. Warren's blood ran hot. Overreacted? His jaw clenched. You watched that man put his hands on our daughter. And you did nothing. Savannah's face twisted in irritation. It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that, he interrupted. His voice was calm, but inside he was a hurricane. And the worst part? I expected it. Because that's who you are, Savannah. You've always been selfish. Always been reckless. Always put your own desires above your family. Savannah's face darkened. You think you're better than me? Warren met her gaze, cold and unflinching. No. I know I am. Silence stretched between them like a blade. Then Savannah stood, smoothing her dress. I'll see you in court, Warren. And with that she walked away. Warren sat in the silence, his heart pounding. Savannah was gone. Dax was gone. But it wasn't over. Not yet. Because men like Dax didn't just disappear quietly. And if he ever came back, if he ever tried to touch Marlo again, Warren wouldn't hesitate next time. Next time there wouldn't be a warning. There would only be justice. What would you do if the law wasn't enough to protect the ones you love? Chapter 11, The Plan. Warren sat in his study, the soft glow of his desk lamp casting shadows across the room. His hands rested on the thick manila folder in front of him. Dax Remington's entire criminal history. He should have been satisfied. He had forced Dax to leave town. His daughter was safe. But something inside him refused to rest. Because men like Dax, they never really leave. His gut told him this wasn't over. Dax would come back. He was a parasite, and parasites always return to feed. Warren opened the folder, his eyes scanning the pages of sealed cases, dropped charges and suspiciously lenient sentences. Someone had been covering for Dax, pulling strings behind the scenes. That meant one thing. Dax wasn't working alone. Warren exhaled, leaning back in his chair. The law had failed too many times. This time he wouldn't rely on the system. This time he would set a trap. He reached for his phone and made a call. A gruff voice answered on the second ring. Judge Delacroix. Didn't expect to hear from you. Warren's voice was steady. Cold. Calculated. I need a favor. Pause. Then, you finally ready to get your hands dirty? Warren glanced at the folder again, his jaw tightening. No, he said. I'm ready to clean up a mess. Chapter 12, Gathering Ammunition. Warren met Eddie Russo at a dimly lit diner just outside the city. Eddie wasn't just a private investigator. He was the kind of man who dug up secrets the police couldn't find. The kind of man who found answers Warren needed. Eddie leaned back in the booth, stirring his coffee lazily. So, let me get this straight. You want dirt on Dax Remington? Yes, Warren said. Everything you can get? Eddie smirked. I thought you were the kind of guy who played by the rules. I was, Warren said. Not anymore. Eddie chuckled, taking a sip of coffee. Well, lucky for you, I already did some digging after you called. He slid a USB drive across the table. Warren picked it up. What's on this? Dax's real rap sheet, Eddie said. Not the one the cops have. The one that gets buried. Drug running. Money laundering. Arms deals. He shook his head. And that's just the beginning? Warren's grip on the drive tightened. Savannah brought this man into their daughter's life. He had help, Eddie continued. A guy like Dax doesn't dodge that many charges without a friend in high places. Warren narrowed his eyes. Who? Eddie leaned in, his voice lowering. Gordon Langley. Warren's chest tightened. Langley. The district attorney. The man who sat in his courtroom. The man who preached about upholding justice. And the man who had been protecting a criminal like Dax. Warren clenched his jaw. This was bigger than he thought. And now, he wasn't just going after Dax. He was going after everyone who had let this happen. Chapter 13. Silent Stalking. Warren sat in his parked car, watching from a distance as Gordon Langley exited a high-end restaurant, laughing with a group of wealthy businessmen. The man looked untouchable, polished, powerful, and completely unaware that his sins were about to catch up with him. Warren's fingers tapped against the steering wheel. He had spent his entire life believing in the law, believing in the system. But now he saw the truth. The system was rigged. People like Langley and Dax got away with their crimes because they knew how to bend the rules. Not this time. Warren pulled out his phone and called Eddie. "What now, Judge?" Eddie asked. "I need Langley's secrets," Warren said. "Bank records, meetings, offshore accounts. If he's covering for Dax, there's a trail." Eddie let out a low whistle. "You're really going all in on this, huh?" "I don't have a choice," Warren said. "This isn't just about revenge anymore. This is about justice." Eddie sighed. "All right. I'll see what I can find." Warren ended the call and exhaled. He had spent years sitting on a bench, judging men like Langley and Dax. Now, he was stepping off that bench, and into the shadows. And when he was done, there wouldn't be a courtroom in the world that could save them. Chapter 14. The Setup. Warren sat in his study, staring at the evidence spread across his desk. Bank statements, confidential emails, surveillance photos. The real truth about Gordon Langley and Dax Remington was laid out in black and white. Langley wasn't just protecting Dax, he was funding him. Warren exhaled, his mind moving like a well-oiled machine. Everything was falling into place. The system was corrupt, and he had all the ammunition he needed to destroy it. But evidence alone wouldn't be enough. People like Langley and Dax knew how to bury the truth, how to twist the facts and come out clean. He had to be smarter. His phone buzzed. A message from Eddie. "Meet me. I found something big." Warren grabbed his coat and headed out, the USB drive tucked safely in his pocket. The bar was nearly empty when Warren walked in. Eddie sat in a dark booth, a whiskey glass half full in front of him. Warren slid into the seat. "Talk." Eddie looked around before lowering his voice. "Langley's not just protecting Dax, he's been laundering money for an entire network of criminals. Dirty cops, politicians, cartel ties. If you go after him, you're going after an empire." Warren's jaw tightened. He had expected corruption, but this was bigger than he ever imagined. Eddie slid over a file. "And here's the kicker. Dax ain't running scared." He met Warren's gaze. "He's back." A cold chill ran down Warren's spine. He had forced Dax to leave. He had warned him. But Dax wasn't the type to walk away. Warren leaned back, exhaling through his nose. His pulse was slow, controlled. He made the wrong choice. Eddie chuckled, shaking his head. "Judge, I think you're about to do something real dangerous." Warren's lips curled into something dark. "I'm about to do something real necessary." Chapter 15. The Warning. The night was humid, the New Orleans air thick with the scent of rain and gasoline. Warren sat in his car watching. Waiting. Dax had returned to his old stomping grounds, a sleazy club in the city's underbelly. Same arrogance. Same cocky strut. Like he had nothing to fear. Warren's fingers curled around the steering wheel. Dax didn't just ignore his warning, he spit on it. He checked his watch. Time for a lesson. He stepped out of the car, adjusting his suit jacket. He wasn't a judge tonight. He wasn't here to mediate. He was here to deliver consequences. The club's bouncer barely glanced at him as he walked in, the heavy bass vibrating in his chest. The air smelled like sweat, liquor, and cheap cigars. Dax sat at the VIP section, a girl in his lap, a bottle of whiskey in his hand. Relaxed. Comfortable. Warren approached slowly, his presence cutting through the noise like a blade. Dax looked up. His lips curled into a smirk. Well, look who's here." The girl in his lap giggled, oblivious to the storm about to break. Warren ignored her. His gaze was locked on Dax. "I warned you." His voice was even, but the promise underneath was deadly. Dax took a slow sip of whiskey, feigning indifference. "And I told you, Judge, I don't take orders." Warren leaned in, lowering his voice. "Leave town. Now." Dax's smirk widened. "Or what? You gonna lecture me? File a motion?" He chuckled, shaking his head. You don't scare me, Delacroix. Warren's jaw tightened. His patience snapped. With one swift motion, he grabbed the whiskey bottle and slammed it down onto the table, the glass shattering, amber liquid spilling everywhere. The room went dead silent. Dax froze, his smirk faltering. For the first time, there was hesitation in his eyes. Warren's voice was a low growl. If you don't disappear, Dax, I'll make sure you don't get a second chance. The silence stretched. A battle of wills. Then Dax chuckled, forced. Nervous. He lifted his hands in mock surrender. All right, Judge. I hear you. Warren stepped back, his gaze never wavering. Then act like it. And with that he turned and walked out. The message was delivered. But he knew one thing for certain. Dax wasn't done. And the next time they met, there wouldn't be any warnings. Chapter 16, The Bait. The next morning, Warren sat in his office, a cup of black coffee untouched on his desk. His mind was already 5 steps ahead. Dax wasn't going to run. He was too proud. Too reckless. Which meant Warren had to force him into a corner. He pulled out his phone and dialed Eddie. Talk, Eddie answered. I need you to leak something, Warren said, his voice firm. Let Dax think the cops are after him. Spread a rumor. Get him paranoid. Eddie let out a low whistle. You're playing a dangerous game, Judge. This isn't a game. Warren's grip on the phone tightened. Dax is like a wounded animal. He's either going to run or he's going to fight. He exhaled. And I'm counting on the latter. Silence. Then Eddie chuckled. All right. Consider it done. By nightfall the trap was set. Dax would hear whispers of a sealed indictment. A warrant. Cops watching his every move. And when a man like Dax felt cornered, he would come straight for the person he blamed the most. Warren leaned back in his chair, his pulse steady. He was waiting. Ready. Because the next time Dax came looking for him would be the last time. Chapter 17, The Final Straw. The city of New Orleans hummed with life, but for Warren, everything had gone silent. He sat in his study, the weight of what was coming pressing against his chest like a vice. The bait was set. Dax would take it. And when he did, it would be the end. A soft knock broke the silence. Marlowe stood in the doorway, her small frame tense. Dad. Warren pushed aside his thoughts and forced a smile. Hey, sweetheart. What's wrong? She hesitated, chewing her bottom lip. I heard Mom on the phone, she was talking about you. His chest tightened. What did she say? Marlowe shifted. She was mad. She said you were stirring up trouble. That you should have just let Dax leave instead of whatever you're doing. She swallowed. Dad, what's happening? Warren exhaled slowly. He had always shielded her from the darkness in the world, but that darkness had come for them now. And it was time she knew the truth. He gestured for her to come in. She sat beside him, curling her legs up on the chair. There are people in this world who think they can do whatever they want, he said. Hurt people. Destroy lives. And never pay for it. He looked into her eyes, his voice steady, firm. But that's not how this works. Not anymore. Marlowe frowned. You're talking about Dax? Yes. Pause. Then, in a whisper, are you going to stop him? Warren hesitated, not because he didn't know the answer, but because he wasn't sure she was ready for it. So instead he said, I'm going to make sure he never hurts you again. Marlowe nodded slowly, something unreadable in her eyes. She didn't ask what that meant. Maybe she already knew. Chapter 18, The Kidnapping. The trap was working. Eddie called just after midnight. You were right, Judge. Dax is losing it. Warren gripped his phone. What happened? He's been all over town looking for you. He thinks the cops are on to him. Eddie chuckled. Idiot's getting sloppy. Warren's pulse steadied. This was it. Where is he now? Last I checked? Passed out drunk in that rat hole motel on the east side. Eddie hesitated. You sure about this? Warren's jaw tightened. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. He ended the call, grabbed his coat and walked out the door. The motel smelled like piss and desperation. Warren moved silently through the halls, the weight of what he was about to do sitting heavy in his chest, but not heavy enough to stop him. Dax's room was at the far end. The door was unlocked. Sloppy. Reckless. He pushed it open. Dax was face down on the bed, the stink of whiskey and sweat clinging to the air. Perfect. With a swift motion, Warren clamped a hand over Dax's mouth and pressed a gun against his temple. Dax jolted awake, struggling, but Warren dug the barrel deeper against his skull. "Move and I pull the trigger." Dax's breath hitched. The room went deathly silent. "You should have left town," Warren murmured, his voice low and calm. "Now, you don't get a choice." The last thing Dax saw was the cold, unflinching gaze of the man who had finally decided to stop playing by the rules. Then everything went black. Chapter 19, The Trial. Dax woke up gagged and tied to a chair. The room was dark, lit only by a single, flickering bulb. The scent of damp wood and old metal filled the air. Panic filled his eyes as he struggled against the restraints. He let out a muffled yell, but no one was coming to save him. Warren sat across from him, calm, composed, like a judge ready to deliver a verdict. "I want you to understand something," Warren said, his voice eerily soft. "You lost?" Dax glared, trying to speak through the gag. Warren leaned forward, his gaze dark. "You laid your hands on my daughter. You walked into my home, took my wife, and thought there wouldn't be consequences." He exhaled, slow and steady. "I've spent my life believing in the law, in justice. But people like you?" He shook his head. "You don't deserve justice. You deserve punishment." Dax's breathing quickened. He yanked at the restraints, but they held firm. Warren pulled a folder from the table and tossed it in front of him. "Gordon Langley. Your little guardian angel. He's next." Dax's eyes widened. Warren smirked. "Oh yeah? You thought I didn't know? You thought you were just some lucky bastard who kept dodging prison?" He leaned closer. "Your luck just ran out." Dax started shaking his head violently, muffled screams escaping his throat. Warren watched, his expression unreadable. Then he stood up. "You always ran from consequences, Dax." He picked up a roll of duct tape, tearing off a strip. "But not this time." And as Dax's muffled screams filled the room, Warren smiled. The real judgment had begun. Chapter 20. The Verdict, Call to Action. Moment number 2. Dax had spent his life avoiding consequences. Not anymore. Warren stood over him, his voice calm, controlled. "You always thought you were untouchable. That someone like me would never come after you." He tilted his head. "How does it feel knowing you lost?" Dax's eyes darted around wildly. Pleading. Begging. Warren wasn't moved. He lifted the USB drive. "I have everything I need to make sure you disappear." He tossed it onto the table, watching as realization dawned on Dax's face. "By the time they find you, if they ever do, you'll already be a ghost." Dax's muffled scream tore through the room. Warren exhaled. Justice had failed too many times. But tonight he wasn't failing. Tonight he was making sure men like Dax never walked free again. How far would you go to deliver real justice? If you had the power to stop a monster, would you? Subscribe and stay tuned, because this isn't over. The real enemy is still out there, and Warren isn't done yet. Chapter 21. The Sentence. Dax's muffled screams echoed through the empty warehouse, bouncing off the cold cement walls. No one would hear him. No one would come. Warren stood over him, arms crossed, watching as panic set in. Dax wasn't laughing anymore. He reached down, pulling the duct tape from Dax's mouth in one swift motion. Dax sucked in a shaky breath, his lips trembling. "Please," he croaked. "You don't have to do this." Warren tilted his head. "You didn't give Marlowe that choice, did you?" Dax's mouth opened, but no words came. Warren stepped forward, eyes dark. "You're a coward. You prey on people who can't fight back. But now, you're the one tied to the chair." Dax's breathing quickened. He jerked against the restraints, but they held firm. There was no escape. Warren crouched beside him. "Here's what's going to happen." He pulled a small recorder from his pocket and placed it on the table. "You're going to confess. To everything." Dax swallowed hard. "And if I don't?" Warren leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then you disappear." Dax's body went rigid. His eyes darted around, looking for some way out. "There is no way out, Dax," Warren said, reading his thoughts. "No lawyer. No judge to save you. This is your last chance." Dax hesitated. Then finally his shoulders sagged. He knew he had lost. Warren pressed record. "Start talking." And with a trembling voice, Dax confessed. Chapter 22. The Cleanup. Warren sat in his car, the weight of what he had done pressing against his chest like a heavy stone. Dax was gone. Not dead but erased. The confession was on the recorder. The evidence was solid. Warren had made sure that Dax Remington would never hurt anyone again. Eddie had arranged for him to be handed over to people who had their own reasons to want him gone. People who didn't rely on courts and legal systems to deal with their problems. Dax was out of Warren's hands. Out of his world. And yet, he didn't feel relief. He had spent years believing in due process and justice. Now he had crossed the line. But then he thought of Marlo. Of the bruise on her arm. Of her shaky voice when she had called him that night. And just like that, the doubt was gone. His phone buzzed. A message from Eddie. It's done. No loose ends. Warren exhaled. One monster down. One more to go. Because Gordon Langley was still out there. And Warren wasn't finished yet. Chapter 23, The Missing Man. The news broke 2 days later. Local man disappears without a trace. Police investigate possible foul play. Warren sat in his office, the article open on his computer. Dax was officially missing. No body. No leads. Savannah called him that evening. Where is he? She demanded, voice laced with anger. Warren leaned back in his chair. Come, Cole. I wouldn't know. You did something, she hissed. I know you did. He let the silence stretch. Then, slowly, deliberately, he said, If I did, do you think anyone would find out? The silence on the other end was deafening. You bastard, she whispered. Warren's lips curled into a smirk. Be careful, Savannah. You wouldn't want to end up on the wrong side of this too. She hung up without another word. Warren set his phone down. Savannah was scared. Good. Because she wasn't innocent in all of this. And if she thought Dax was the only one who could disappear, she was dead wrong. Chapter 24, The Investigation. Warren knew the police would come knocking. He had expected it. Dax Remington was a violent criminal, but he was also a well-connected one. The New Orleans Police Department didn't particularly care that Dax was gone, but someone did. 2 days after the disappearance made headlines, Warren heard the knock at his door. He opened it to find Detective Frank Calloway, an old-school investigator with sharp eyes and a gut that had cracked hundreds of cases. Calloway held up his badge. Judge Delacroix. Got a minute? Warren gestured him inside, keeping his expression neutral. I assume this is about Dax Remington? Calloway nodded, stepping into the study. He glanced around. Nice place. You don't seem too broken up about your wife's boyfriend going missing. Warren smirked. You assume I care. Calloway studied him for a long moment. Word on the street is, Dax had enemies. A lot of them. Any idea who might have wanted him gone? Warren shrugged. Detective, you just said it yourself. Dax had a lot of enemies. Maybe he finally pissed off the wrong one. Calloway's jaw tightened. He wasn't buying it. You and I both know men like Dax don't just disappear. Someone made that happen. Warren met his gaze, voice cold. Then maybe you should find them. A beat of silence. Then Calloway sighed, rubbing a hand down his face. For what it's worth, he said, lowering his voice, I never liked the guy. He had it coming. Warren tilted his head. Then maybe this city just did itself a favor. Calloway watched him carefully, then gave a small nod and turned for the door. Warren exhaled slowly as it clicked shut behind him. The police weren't a problem. Not yet. But Gordon Langley still was. And Warren wasn't finished. Chapter 25, The Psychological Toll. The nightmare started the next night. Warren woke up drenched in sweat, his chest heaving. The echoes of Dax's muffled screams rang in his ears. He had done what needed to be done. But some part of him, the part that had sworn to uphold justice, to never let emotions dictate his actions, was cracking. He sat at the edge of his bed, rubbing his face. He couldn't afford to break down now. Langley was still out there. And Warren knew without a doubt that the DA was already looking for him. He had to keep moving. But that morning, as he poured himself a cup of coffee, he felt a presence behind him. Marlo. She stood in the doorway watching him. You're different, she said quietly. Warren turned, forcing a smile. How so? She hesitated. I don't know. Just different. Warren exhaled. His daughter was smart. Too smart. But he couldn't let her see what was happening inside him. So he knelt, meeting her eyes. Everything I do is for you. You know that, right? Marlo nodded, but her gaze held something else. Something uncertain. Warren felt it deep in his bones. He was losing pieces of himself. And soon there might be nothing left. Chapter 26, The Widow's Cry. Savannah showed up at Warren's house that evening. She was a mess, makeup smudged, hair disheveled, tears streaking her face. Warren leaned against the doorway, unimpressed. "You're drunk?" Savannah scoffed. "You're a monster." He crossed his arms. "Because your pet criminal is gone?" Her eyes flashed with fury. "Because you did something to him?" Warren studied her, his expression unreadable. "And what exactly do you think I did?" Savannah swallowed hard. "I don't know. But I know you." She stepped closer, voice trembling. "Tell me the truth." Warren tilted his head. She wasn't crying for Dax. Not really. She was crying because she was afraid. Afraid she was next. He leaned down, voice low. "Be careful, Savannah." Her breath hitched. He straightened. "You've already chosen the wrong side once. Don't do it again." Savannah took a shaky step back, her face pale. And then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Warren shut the door behind her, his jaw clenched. He had a final move to make. And it was time to take down Gordon Langley once and for all. This was not the end. Dax Remington was gone. But the true enemy? Still out there. Still watching. Warren Delacroix had crossed a line, and there was no turning back. The battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. Coming soon. Part 2, The Judge's Final War. Justice is no longer enough. Now it's personal. Stay tuned, like and subscribe to our channel. Thanks.